am Matt Althauser. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at Amplitude. Excuse me. And I am very excited to be here in Boston today. And we have a really great lineup in store for you. So if you're not familiar with our company, our mission is actually to help companies build better products. And so far, we've actually done that with about 5,000 different companies around the world. So we're very excited about that progress. And we've also helped people understand, excuse me, I have a bad cough today, understand exactly how to think about product strategy. And we've done that by releasing the book that's actually in front of you today. This is the first volume in the Product Analytics Playbook. And hopefully, we'll be releasing more of these very soon. So far, it's been downloaded by about 20,000 different companies around the world. So very, very excited about that progress. At the beginning of this year, we actually set out with a goal as a company to try to help more and more people understand what is product analytics. And we set out to do these road shows across the world. We've actually been in London, New York, Seattle, Los Angeles, and now here in Boston, as well as where we're from in San Francisco. And we've had over 1,000 people actually attend these. So we're very thankful for everyone to take time out of their busy schedules and be here with us. But hopefully you guys will get something out of this. And if nothing else, you'll at least get some socks. So please make sure and grab those at the front. But really, I hope you guys do get something to help you all build better products. So one thing we've noticed as we've gone around the world, we've seen a trend. And that trend is that the best product teams out there are finding ways to incorporate data into their build planning process. They're using that to understand what's working, what's not working, and really the best teams are even using it to look at what they should build next. To really, really understand this trend and talk about this in a lot more depth, I'm really excited to announce our first speaker. That's Justin Bauer, who is our VP of Product at Amplitude. Before his time at our company, he was actually in the advanced analytics group at McKinsey, where he worked with a bunch of different clients to try to figure out these things. So please listen up. He's going to have a lot to explain. So please give him a round of applause. Justin Bauer.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you, everyone, for attending today. Really excited to kick off the Product Analytics Summit. As Matt mentioned, my name is Justin Bauer, and I am the VP of Product here at Amplitude. And as Matt mentioned, at Amplitude, our mission is to help companies build better products. And the way that we do that is we develop analytics software that our customers use to understand what their users are doing within their apps and websites, and how those actions can help drive things like retention, engagement, or conversion. And we work with thousands of different product companies, including those that you see here on the screen, as well as the companies that our speakers after me are from: HubSpot, Athena Health, and LastPass. And at Amplitude, we were founded on a vision and a belief that we are entering a new era. And if you've been paying attention to the CEOs of some of the world's largest companies, you might also share that belief. Companies like Adidas, who are talking about how they are transitioning from being an apparel company to actually using digital to drive their goal of helping athletes accomplish their objectives. Or companies like Valeris, who believe that in 5 years they'll no longer be an airline company, but in fact a digital company that happens to fly airlines. Or even Disney, who recently announced that they will now be releasing a direct-to-consumer product so that they can compete with upstarts like Netflix and others within their space. So what do all these companies have in common? Well, they're all examples of companies entering the era of being product-led. So what does that mean? What does it mean to be a product-led company? Well, to describe that, I've found it's actually helpful to kind of go back in time and talk about the previous eras, the eras of the sales and marketing-led company. So let's go back 30 years ago and imagine that you're looking to buy a new product. What you did is you probably reached out to a salesperson because they were the ones who were most knowledgeable about the space and could teach you about the latest and greatest things that were going on. And because of that, sales was really the only department in a company that could be held accountable to actually driving revenue. Yes, marketing existed, but marketing was really a cost center. In fact, kind of lived by the old saying that half of our advertising dollars are wasted, we just don't know which half. But then online came along, and now we could measure things. And now marketing started being held accountable to driving business outcomes. And if you think about the websites and apps of the early 90s and 2000s, they really were marketing vehicles, kind of digital brochures of the time. And yes, product and engineering were the ones that released new features and updates to those websites, but it was really marketing that owned the engagement and growth of them. And so if you think about it, in the 90s and early 2000s, marketing really owned the product. It wasn't really owned by product and engineering. But today, that's different. Today, those websites, those applications, that is the product that we're selling. And in fact, this is happening in every industry, not just in the tech industry, but across every single vertical. And because of that, we're now seeing product teams actually being held accountable to driving business outcomes. As an example of that, how many people here are familiar with the company Peloton, by show of hands? A fair number of people. For those of you who aren't, Peloton is an exercise bike manufacturer. Except really, they're not. They're actually a digital product company. So Peloton uses Amplitude to track their customers from the point where they first learn about their product on some social feed to when they land on their e-commerce site, to the actual bike that they buy, to the usage within that bike, to the classes that they actually buy to use on that bike. And now that they have their own stores and are actually being seen in gyms, they can actually track that activity as well. Imagine being an incumbent exercise manufacturer and trying to compete with that. You can't unless you also become product-led. And the companies that are leading this charge are doing extremely well. Companies like Apple, Facebook, Snapchat, Tesla, Amazon. All of these companies are really changing the world, and they're doing it through their product. And what they're doing is actually changing the game. And with that, the rules of engagement are now changing. And we've seen three key things that are true in the product-led era that wasn't true in the eras before that. The first is that product is now your distribution channel. So think about it. If you're looking to buy a new product, in the sales-led era, talk to a salesperson. In the marketing-led era, you went to the marketing site to learn about it. But in today's era, what do? You go to reviews. You see what other people who've used the product talk about, or you just use it yourself. The buying process is no longer disconnected from the usage of the product. I'm sure many of you here are familiar with the concept of freemium. Gaming really made that popular, but we're seeing that now happen in every single industry, from media all the way to B2B. And I guarantee you that if you're not thinking about how you can use product as your distribution center at your company, your competitors are. Second, product is now your competitive advantage. The barriers to entry in the product-led era are practically zero. And because of that, we've seen an explosion in the number of offerings that are out there. Just because someone previously bought your product does not mean they will continue to use it. In the product-led era, lock-in is extinct and retention is now king. And finally, product is your driver of customer loyalty. Consumer loyalty to brands is at an all-time low. But what consumers are loyal to is experiences. And so you need to continually deliver on the best experience possible for your customers, because if you're not, they will then go on to one of those other offerings that exist within the marketplace. And no industry is immune from this effect. Okay, so if this is what's happening, what do we need to do to win within the product-led era? Well, we can actually go back to some of those companies that we saw previously. Companies like Facebook, companies like Amazon, or companies like Tesla. And we look to see what they're doing to be successful in the product-led era. So if you look at all these, what is one thing that they all have in common? Speed. That's right. But it's not just undirected speed. It's speed of learning. It's speed of talking to the customer, reacting to what the customer wants, and building for the customer. Or, as Charles Darwin put it, it's not the strongest or the most intelligent, but those that are most responsive to change that will survive. Okay, so if we know it's about speed, we know it's about being responsive to change, why don't we see more companies doing this? And what we found is that there are really three reasons why this isn't happening within companies. The first is that most companies actually are pretty poor at understanding the needs of their customers. Second is that those who do understand the needs of the customers don't actually have the power to act on that. And then finally, no one is held accountable to actually driving outcomes. Now, product-led companies take this and flip it on its head. And to start, they're customer obsessed. So what does that mean to be customer obsessed? Well, it means that the product teams are the experts in the customer. Repeat that again. The product teams are the experts in the customer. They do not outsource customer insights to some third-party research group within the company, but they work with that part of the company to make sure that they are the experts in the customer. The second thing they do is they use data to inform their product decisions, not just validate decisions that they have already made. And finally, they go beyond the vanity metrics, but dive deep into their data to really understand what is driving user behavior. An example of this is a company called Instacart. So many of you are probably familiar with them. And they use Amplitude to understand what drives their user behavior. And they don't look at vanity metrics like installs or even app opens, but instead define what we call a critical event. So a critical event is an action that a user takes that demonstrates they're getting value out of the product. And for them, that action is making a purchase. And so when they talk about weekly active users, they actually talk about weekly active purchasers. But they don't just stop there. They then break that down to what drives that, something that we call the product analytics formula. Understand what are the key drivers of your metrics, such that you can get deeper into your data. So an example of this, I can actually talk about Amplitude. So at Amplitude, our critical event is running a query. But we don't just look at that. We look at what drives total queries run within a week. And so we break that into 3 components. The first is breadth, which is our weekly querying users. The second is depth, which is the average number of queries they run per day. And then finally, frequency. How many days per week do they actually come to run a query within the product? And by doing that, we can now understand what builds up to that, and we can continue to build out this formula and understand the drivers of engagement overall for our product. The second thing that product-led companies do is they decentralize decision making. They make sure that those that are closest to the customer have the power to act upon that. And how do they do that? Well, they make sure that leadership is aligned to vision, but not direction. They give autonomy to the product teams to actually make the decisions, but make sure that's aligned against the vision for the company. And how they do that is they make sure that those teams have access to the data they need to quickly make decisions and not get stuck with bottlenecks in other departments. So how do companies do this? Well, we see a lot of product-led companies using a new product development process that Spotify actually made really popular recently, which is this concept of squads and tribes. So I'll quickly explain how this works. So a squad is an autonomous group of people. So you'll have a product owner, you'll have a designer, maybe 2 or 3 engineers. The important thing is it is small, and it is defined around a common understanding of the customer and a common metric that that squad can drive. And then these squads are organized into a broader group of people called a tribe. And this tribe is held accountable to an end-to-end business outcome and sets a broader vision on how to accomplish that. A couple things emerge when you do this. One, everyone now understands the broader vision of what they're working towards, but you're giving the individual squads the autonomy to make the right decisions to help drive that vision. Now, Yellow Pages takes that a step further, and the analytics team at Yellow Pages uses Amplitude to make sure that each of these squads can move very fast. So they make sure that the squads can ask and answer questions around user behavior quickly, so they no longer become the bottleneck to them, but are then actually serving those squads and helping them move faster. By doing this, they have seen that they've been able to change their release process from every 3 months to every 2 weeks, which has been a huge impact in terms of the product that they've been able to build. And finally, product-led teams make sure that they hold product accountable to business outcomes. So what does that mean? They're held accountable to an outcome and not a schedule. And when you do this, you start to remove the finger pointing that can exist within the silos of product or engineering, because it's no longer about the schedule, it's about, are we delivering the outcome? Now that outcome is really important too. That outcome needs to be tied to a business objective. What does the customer care about? It can't be things like lines of code shipped or sprint points delivered or even features shipped. It needs to be aligned to a business objective. And then finally, make sure that everyone in the company has visibility into that, because that is what ultimately will drive accountability. An example of that is something I'm sure many people here are familiar with, the concept of OKRs. If you're not, it's popularized by Intel and then Google. And what it stands for is objective, or kind of the vision. And then your key results, or what are the metrics that you use to make sure that you're driving towards that vision. And we've seen that a lot of Amplitude customers take that a step further and actually make sure that everyone has visibility into the OKRs that each of them individually have. And they do that by creating things like team-wide or company-wide dashboards. So now everyone can see the progress that's being made, and they can actually start to tie the dots to how that connects to the larger vision within the company. Cool. So to recap, if you're looking to become a product-led company, to move faster, to really deliver on the needs of the customers, there's 3 things that we think are critical. The first is that you make sure that your product team is customer obsessed and goes beyond the vanity metrics. The second is that you're actually giving the product team the power to actually act upon that by decentralizing decision making, but making sure everyone's aligned to the vision. And then finally, you make sure that you're holding those teams accountable to driving that outcome, and that everyone has visibility into the performance that's happening there. Great. If you're interested in this, we'll definitely have time afterwards to chat about it. I'm also going to open it up for questions shortly. We will send out this deck, so if you want to see some of this, just let us know, but we'll send it out to everyone. But with that, I'd love to thank you all for being here and open it up for questions. Yeah, great question. So difference between B2B and B2C and the importance of it. So we've found that analytics is critical for both. Now I think B2C kind of started first because it had more data, more customers. So you kind of saw a lot of the big data movement happen initially within B2C. But now in B2B, honestly, like all the trends that we're seeing today around making sure you're delivering what the customer wants, the fact that just because you sold the license to them doesn't mean they're going to continue to use it. Like all those trends are happening within B2B as well. And so we have found, and we work with thousands of different B2B customers. In fact, Dan from HubSpot can talk to basically the work that they've done using Amplitude. But we found it's really critical because in the end, like, does it really matter if you're selling to a business or a consumer? Who's the end user? It's a consumer. In the product-led era, it's about the consumer talking about the product, right, and using the product. And if they're not using it, I guarantee you, when you come up for your renewal, right, they're not going to continue to buy it. So I think the trends are the same, and we see a ton of companies starting to use data now to help drive and make sure that they're winning within this new era. So, Salesforce. Yes. Yes. So explain Salesforce. Okay, so Salesforce has an advantage of being a first mover in a huge new technology, right? They won a lot of, basically have gotten to where they are because of a lot of movement they've had. I guarantee you over the next 5 years, and we're already seeing it today, right? The nipping at the heels, they're not going to be immune, right? You can make the same argument of Disney 10 years ago, right? Like all of these companies are starting to see that if they're not serving the customer, they're going to end up losing. It may take a little bit longer for Salesforce, but I guarantee you if they do not start to become product-led, they're going to start to see that.
Do you see most of your customers use Amplitude for discovery, meaning the user journey and friction points and all that, or do you start with a solid understanding of the journey and then use data to?
Yeah, so we see both. We typically see customers start by just wanting to understand, like, we just made this release, what is the impact of this release? So that's kind of what I call considered kind of the first level for customers. So we just released this new feature, are people using it or not? That then opens up the next question, which is, if they're not, why not? Right? And that then leads to discovery, because then you see, well, what are the things that they're doing that actually helps drive something else? Because you built that feature for a reason, right? You built it because you're hoping to drive conversion, you're hoping to drive engagement, retention, whatever that is. And so then you start that discovery process where you're looking at, well, this didn't work, but oh, look, we see a bunch of users using these features and they are retaining. Why is that? So then you might build some features to test hypotheses there, see if it worked, and if it does, that starts to lead you in a certain direction. So we see all of that, but typically people start with just getting a lay of like what is happening right now, what features are people using and not, and then start to build up to then how do we actually make improvements beyond that.
And do you see any kind of variability in terms of sample sizes? Some products that are industry specific, very narrow user bases versus some of the examples you gave are millions of people, right?
Yeah, so I think it definitely depends on the size of your user base, but we work with companies on the larger end that are sending us hundreds of billions of events per year, and on the smaller end, like 10 million events per year. And so in the end, like you'll have the data. You can still make decisions based off the data. Some analyses may not work as well. So if you have a very small data set, you may not be able to do correlation analysis for some very specific features that you have because you just don't have enough data. But even then, I think there's a lot that you can do to understand user behavior. One thing that we see a lot of companies that have very small data sets and are more qualitatively oriented will do is they'll actually use Amplitude to see what features those users are using, and then they'll reach out to those customers. Versus what traditionally they would do is just like blanket email all their customers or go to some forum. Now they can actually say, well, we see there are 100 people using this feature. Email them, talk to them. So they're using data to help inform decision making. Yeah. Oh, sorry, we got back.
Do you have certain KPIs to measure like what type of interaction is good interaction versus bad interaction?
Yes, so great question. So what we recommend is that every company figure out what those KPIs are for them. And they use the data to help drive that. So it starts by thinking about what is your overall objective, right? And from there you can then build out, and that's basically what the product analytics formula is, right? You then start to understand like what those KPIs are. So for us, right, examples of our KPIs. So our overall objective is we want to drive ARR. We're a B2B company, right? So that's our key objective. So we look at how does the product drive ARR. And what we have found is that weekly querying users correlates very highly with our ability to upsell. So on renewal, if we see a company has a ton of users, right, we're more likely to be able to get an upsell with them. And the thing there is, we actually don't charge based on users. So it's a real reflection of the value of a product. And so because of that, we then think about, well, what drives weekly querying users. So we look at new user retention, current user retention, and resurrected user retention. And if you want to learn more about that, that's exactly what we talk about within the playbook that we have. And then we think about, well, what drives each of those? But it starts at the top. What is our overall objective so that we make sure everyone's aligned and everyone understands how their work will help lead to that.
So do you see privacy, security, PII, GDPR type of requirements limiting the amount of insight you can provide?
So the question is, do we see security, PII, a lot of European regulations kind of limiting the insights you can get? So what we see is that companies just have to be smart about the data that they're sending to Amplitude. So you don't need to send PII data into Amplitude. User behavior actions isn't necessarily PII data. And you can do things like user ID hashing to make sure that you're not like exposing an email address, for instance, to us. So there's a lot of ways that you can work around that. And we work with tons of companies. Athena Health is a great example of a company that we work with. We work with Capital One, for instance. There's a lot of companies that are in heavily regulated industries. And so it's just about being smart about the data you need to understand your user actions. But we have a lot of examples of working in those industries.
So you had mentioned this idea of critical events as metrics vis-a-vis so-called vanity metrics, and I was wondering, that can sort of verge on like special snowflake metrics for every single one of the companies you're working with. Do you notice that there are more commonalities to that in terms of finding these critical junction points?
There are common events that you'll see across industries. So in gaming, it's probably going to be like a game completed, purchases made. That's a pretty common critical event. But what we do think is important is you do define that for your product. So one of the things, a great example of this is, we talk about in the playbook, so the concept of retention, right? So retention for almost every company is a critical metric, but how you define retention is really important. So most people define and use what's called end-day retention. That's the most common way that you measure retention, which means you look at what percentage of users come back exactly end days later from their first install. So exactly 4 days later, exactly 14 days later. Now that metric makes sense if you're a gaming company because you want to drive users into your application every day, and a lot of empirical evidence suggests that if you don't, they will churn. But if you're Instacart, right? If you're Postmates, if you're a company, like why do you care if somebody comes back exactly 4 days later, right? You don't. It needs to reflect your actual usage. So we make sure to give you the flexibility to define that for your company and then measure and track that within Amplitude.
I've got the microphone, so I get to ask the next question. Hi. Do you have any customers that are working with installed, on-premise software? And then if so, can you describe a little bit how you get the data and how you work with them?
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways you can get data into Amplitude. So if you're on-prem, you can actually use a server-side integration. So a lot of times companies already have a data pipeline, and they will just send that data to us, and then they can analyze all of that data within Amplitude. So you don't have to use our client-side logging. So if you already have that, Amplitude works great, and we have lots of examples of customers who do that.
So do you have a framework for how you can go about determining what your critical event might actually be?
Yes. In fact, we talk about it within the Product Analytics Playbook. So in there, we talk about basically think through what is the overall business objective, what is the value of the customer. You can actually use data to see what that is, see what correlates with you accomplishing that, and that will help guide you towards kind of what that event is.
I have a question, which is, we're getting a lot of data from our existing customers, so that helps with, average revenue per, retention numbers. Do you have any sort of examples of customers who are using it to kind of move their product into new segments or, sort of move beyond their existing user base? Are you seeing product analytics helping make those decisions of kind of new market segments we're moving into?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a couple ways. I can actually give an example from Amplitude and how we used product analytics to do that. So one of the things that we believe in is the concept of 10x and then 10%. So we have a 10x vision, right, but then increment at a 10% level. So you have a new vision for a new product line, right, or a new extension you want to build out. Think about what's the minimum viable product you can go and test, and then go test that. And many times you can actually test that with your user base. And actually do a quick launch of something and then see what is the engagement of that. Are people actually using that? And then if they are, that gives you conviction to continue down that path. So in Amplitude, we have a lot of examples of experiments that we're running within our product. And they are full-blown features, but they give us an insight into, yes, people are now starting to care about this type of usage, so we should consider actually building a new product line around it. And actually, later this month, we'll be basically announcing some new product lines that we'll be launching based on having done that. So we're really excited about that as well.
All right, we've got time for one last question, and then we've got to get on to the next speaker. We'll go all the way down here. We've been biased to this side, so I'm getting a workout today.
So you talk about this formula, breadth times depth times frequency. How does that change if you are working towards simplifying your platform?
So in the end, tell me more about when you say simplifying your platform.
Yeah, so if we're trying to reduce the number of pages that we have, or maybe move some applications together.
Yep.
So how would that change? So if people aren't going as deep or as wide into your application because you have just fewer pages, but maybe they're more successful, is that still a formula that you should be using?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the way I would think about that is, why are you simplifying your product, right? And the answer to that probably is some objective that you're trying to hit. And then what metrics can you use to actually see if you're accomplishing that objective, right? So you may be simplifying it to make sure that users get to their critical event faster, right? We do that at Amplitude. We think about how can we simplify the new user experience, right, such that they get to an activation state. But it's in service of this metric that we can then track. So we can say, hey, when we actually deprecated these 5 features, the new cohort of users that joined, did we see higher retention within that? And if we didn't, then we didn't accomplish our objective. Maybe we should consider bringing those features back. The other thing you can do is use the data to come up with what features you should deprecate. So we call this the anti-product roadmap. We actually look at the features that aren't highly used, and those users who do use it don't use it that frequently. Those are candidates for us to cut. But we're actually using the data to do that, not just people's opinions on what they think is something that should be removed.
Thanks.
Cool. Okay. Well, for everyone else who didn't have a chance to ask their question, I'll definitely be available afterwards, and so really excited to chat with you all then. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Justin.